Getting Grief Right. This is from an article in the New York Times, printed January 10th, 2015. It's from a series called Couch, a series about psychotherapy. By the time Mary came to see me 6 months after losing her daughter to sudden infant death syndrome, she had hired and fired 2 other therapists. She was trying to get her grief right. Mary was a successful accountant, a driven person who was unaccustomed to being weighed down by sorrow. She is also well versed in the so-called stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. To her and so many others in her culture, that meant that grief would be temporary and somewhat predictable, even with the enormity of her loss. She expected to be able to put it behind her and get on with her life. To look at her, she'd already done so. The mask she wore for the world was carefully constructed and effective, and she seemed to epitomize what many people would call doing really well, meaning someone who had experienced a loss but looked as if she was finished grieving. Within a few days of the death of her daughter, she was back at work and seemed to function largely as before. And the truth of her life was something else. 6 months after her baby's death, she remained in deep despair, and she was exhausted from acting better than she felt around coworkers, friends, and family. As is so often the case, she was diagnosed her condition as being stuck in grief, believing that a stubborn depression was preventing her from achieving acceptance and closure. Was she in denial, she wondered? She also wondered if she was appropriately angry. The bottom line was that she knew she was depressed, and a psychiatrist had prescribed an antidepressant, and that's what she wanted me to treat. Earlier in my practice, I would have zeroed in on that depression. Was there a family history? Had she been depressed before? Was the medicine helping? What were her specific symptoms? Knowing the answers might suggest why she was stuck. Or I would have reviewed the stages of grief as she had, looking for one in which the work remained incomplete. But I had begun to operate differently by the time Mary showed up, which was 10 years after my own loss. My firstborn child had also died before he was a year old. And that was why Mary had chosen me. In our first session, I put Mary's depression aside. I asked her to tell me the story of her baby rather than describe the symptoms of her grief. Though she was resistant, she eventually started to talk. And like most other things in Mary's life, the baby, who she named Stephanie, was planned, and Mary was delighted with her pregnancy and had wonderful dreams for her daughter. After a routine delivery, Mary stayed home with Stephanie for the first 3 months. Returning to work had been difficult, but Mary was comfortable with the childcare arrangement and managed to balance motherhood with her busy professional schedule. Then Mary told me about the Saturday when she went to check on her napping daughter and found that Stephanie wasn't breathing. She began CPR as her husband called 911, and there were moments of surreal focus as she and her husband tried to save their baby. Then this woman, so accustomed to being in control, had to surrender her daughter to an emergency crew, and her husband drove as they followed the ambulance to the hospital. She described the waiting room in great detail, down to the color of the furniture, and when the hospital chaplain walked in with the doctor, she knew her baby was gone. She and her husband had were taken into a room where they held the baby for the last time. At this point in her story, Mary finally began to weep, intensely so. She seemed surprised by the waves of emotion that washed over her, and it was the first time since the death that the sadness had poured forth in that way. She said that she never told the story of her daughter from conception to death in one sitting. "What is wrong with me?" she asked as she cried. "It's been almost 7 months." Very gently, using simple, non-clinical words, I suggested to Mary that there was nothing wrong with her. She was not depressed or stuck or wrong. She was just very sad, consumed by sorrow, and not because she was grieving incorrectly. The depth of her sadness was simply a measure of the love she had for her daughter. A transformation occurred when she heard this, and she continued to weep, but the muscles in her face relaxed. I watched as months of pent-up emotions were released. She had spent most of her energy trying to figure out why she was behind in her grieving. She had buried her feelings and vowed to be strong, because that's how a person was supposed to be. Now in my office, stages, self-diagnosis, and societal expectations didn't matter. She was free to surrender to her sorrow, and as she did, the deep bond with her little girl was rekindled. Her loss was now part of her story, one to claim and cherish, not a painful event to try to put in the past. I'd gone through the same process with the loss of my son, and I was in my 2nd year of practice when he died, and I subsequently had many grieving patients referred to me. The problem in those early days was that my grief training was not helping either my patients or me, and when I was trained in the late 1970s, the stages of grief were the standard by which a grieving person's progress was assessed. That model is still deeply and rigidly embedded in our cultural consciousness and psychological language, and it inspires much self-diagnosis and self-criticism among the aggrieved. This is compounded by the often subtle and well-meaning judgment of the surrounding community. A person is to grieve for only so long and with so much intensity. To be sure, some people who come to see me exhibit serious, diagnosable symptoms that require treatment. Many, however, seek help only because they and the people around them believe that time is up on their grief. The truth is that grief is as unique as a fingerprint, conforms to no timetable or societal expectation, and based on my own and my patients' experiences, I now like to say that the story of loss has 3 chapters. Chapter 1 has to do with attachment, the strength of the bond with the person who has been lost, understanding the relationship between degree of attachment and intensity of grief brings great relief for most patients. I often tell them that the size of their grief corresponds to the depth of their love. Chapter 2 is the death event itself. This is often the moment when the person experiencing the loss begins to question his sanity, particularly when the death is premature and traumatic. Mary has prided herself on the ability to stay in control in difficult times. The profound emotional chaos of her baby's death made her feel crazy, and as soon as she was able, she resisted the craziness and shut down the natural pain and suffering. Chapter 3 is the long road that begins after the last casserole dish is picked up, when the outside world stops grieving with you. Mary wanted to reassure her family, friends, and herself that she was on the fast track to closure. This was exhausting. What she really needed was to let herself sink into her sadness and accept it. When I suggested a support group, Mary rejected the idea, but I insisted. She later described the relief she felt in the presence of other bereaved parents, in a place where no acting was required. It was a place where people understood that they didn't really want to achieve closure after all. And to do so would be to lose a piece of a sacred bond. All sorrows can be borne if you put them in a story or tell a story about them, said the writer Isaac Dinesen. When loss is a story, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. There is no pressure to move on, and there is no shame in intensity or duration. Sadness, regret, confusion, yearning, and all the experience of grief become part of the narrative of love for the one who has died.